Member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If ever New Zealanders needed a clear example of the fact that they have a hands-off government who aren't up to the task of running the country, they got it today. Yet another example today in this, the report of the ministerial inquiry into the Novopay project, because I want to quote from page 1. Page 1 of the report that says, this state of affairs and the wider disruptions that were caused were avoidable. All of this entire shambles was avoidable. And Stephen Joyce talked about there's plenty of blame to go around and then proceeded to try and scatter it anywhere except with the ministers who actually made the decisions to sign off on the Novopay project. He blamed the officials, he blamed the past government. Of course, the government have tried to blame the schools, they've tried to blame everyone except for the 3 people who actually signed, put their names on the piece of paper that said go ahead with Novopay. Bill English, Hekia Parata and Craig Foss were the 3 people who signed off on the implementation of Novopay, and ultimately they are the ones who are responsible. It is great that Stephen Joyce has apologised to all of the people who have been affected by this, but why on earth did it take such a long time? Why didn't Hekia Parata front up and apologise? Hekia Parata, the Minister of Education, why didn't she front up and apologise for the massive turmoil that she caused within schools? I agree with another comment Stephen Joyce made, where he said that ministers should be able to trust the advice that they receive from officials. I absolutely agree with that. But ministers get paid $250,000 a year, and one of the reasons they get paid that is to test the veracity of the advice they get and to ask some difficult questions. And where officials give advice that's inconsistent, as was clearly the case in this, it is up to the ministers to say this advice is not good enough and I want better. And they did not do that. They got given advice that said that the milestones had been met and that the milestones hadn't been met in the same report, and it was signed off by 3 ministers. Well, I can tell you now that if that sort of advice was given to me as a minister, I wouldn't sign it off. I'd go back to them, and the very first question I'd ask the officials is, well, which is it? Were the milestones met or were they not? But apparently that was too difficult for Bill English, Hekia Parata and Craig Foss. 3 senior government ministers, and not one of them was able to spot the inconsistency in that report from their officials. Not one of them turned around and said, I'm not satisfied with this advice, I want more information. Not one of them thought to ask, has this actually been tested? Have we actually got some results to show whether this is going to work or not? Not one of those 3 ministers asked for that advice. And had they done so, we would not be here having this debate, because it was abundantly clear before Novopay went live that it was not going to work. And any minister doing their job properly could have established that in a very short order of time, and they did not do so. They did not live up to the expectations that the public should rightly have of them. Did they ask? Were schools involved in the development and the design of the new payroll system? Had they asked that basic, fundamental question, the answer that would have come back was a resounding no, and all of the alarm bells should have been ringing at that point. That the people who had to use the system, the people who had to make it work, weren't actually involved in the project. Had it been tested? Did they ask that question? No, they did not. And then there are a whole lot of questions left unanswered by this report. The report talks about the removal of the contingencies, the phased rollout, and the old system running in parallel. They talk about the fact that that was removed. Well, who signed that off? Who signed off the removal of those contingencies? Because if any minister signed off on the removal of those contingencies, they should resign immediately, because the responsibility is very, very clear. The report is suspiciously silent on that. Not one word on whether the ministers signed off on the removal of the contingencies and why not. If they did, they have to go. It's as simple as that. If they signed off on the removal of the contingencies, then the ministers are responsible for the chaos that followed, and the blame for that rests squarely on their shoulders and nobody else's. They can blame officials, they can blame previous governments, they can blame the schools. ministers were the ones who signed off on the implementation. Ministers are the ones who should accept the responsibility for that. There were known faults, multiple known faults with the system. There was clear evidence that even if the system was ready, the sector was not ready for the implementation of it, and yet it was still signed off anyway. The report finds that, and I'll quote directly, levels of trust between the ministry and the sector that were necessary to ensure the success of the project were not always evident. Well, goodness me, understatement of the decade. There is very little trust between the Ministry of Education and the entire educational community. And the responsibility for that rests with ministers as well, because the Ministry of Education ultimately are simply left with the task of implementing the policy agenda of this government. And it is the policy agenda of this government that has resulted in the massive breakdown in relationships between the Ministry of Education and just about everybody who has to actually implement the policies that the government are trying to ram through. Whether it be national standards, charter schools, performance pay for teachers, all of those other things that this government talk about all of the time, those things have contributed to this breakdown in relationship, and clearly that has had an impact on this project as well. Now, so what is the government going to do next? What happens now? Well, there's some interesting comments in the report. They're talking about removing unnecessary practices, i.e. banking staffing. Now, isn't that interesting? Basically what they're going to do is take away the ability of schools to keep and retain and use any underspend in their staffing allocations. Basically, this is another Bill English clawback, ripping more resources out of schools, ripping more money, more staffing away from schools. This is how they'll make up for their failed bigger class sizes experiment, by removing bank staffing. What does bank staffing do? It allows schools, if they don't use up all of their staffing within the period that they've been allocated it, they can roll it forward, and the government want to take that away, and they want to use their shambles, their Novopay shambles, they want to use that as the excuse for taking away bank staffing. They also talk about reducing the complexity, that's a quote, reducing the complexity of collective employment agreements. Now here we go. Performance pay is on the way. They're going to reduce the complexity of the collective agreements now, and we can expect to see this government trying to ram through major changes to the way teachers and those working in schools are paid. This report is all part of the government's plan to change. Oh, that's a second 2-minute bell, Mr. Speaker. That's very good. I'm just getting warmed up. Because the government are going to use this as an excuse to ram through changes to not just to the payroll system, but to the collective agreements and the very nature of teachers' employment. And that is so totally wrong. Because ultimately, what people wanted to hear from Stephen Joyce, an apology was good. An apology was good. But they actually wanted him to stand up and say, I accept, or Stephen Joyce accepts, that the government made a mistake, that the government should not have signed off on the implementation of Novopay, and yes, that this national government accepts responsibility. And no, nobody heard that from Stephen Joyce today, and they have not heard that all the way through this debacle, which has been going on since August of last year now. It's been going on since August, and still the government tiptoe around the edges and try and shed the blame elsewhere. Stephen Joyce even had the audacity to try and shed the blame onto the previous Labor government, and yet that was actually one of the few positive findings, was that the original procurement of the payroll system was actually okay. That was the bit of it that was all right. It became a shambles when Hekia Parata and Bill English and Craig Foss got involved. They were the ministers who signed off on the Go Live decision. And I'm looking forward to Craig Foss's contribution, because I've seen him taking extensive notes during this debate, And as the person responsible for signing it off, I look forward to him standing up and apologising to schools, apologising to teachers and to support staff, because it's not just teachers, it's all the other staff who work in schools who have been affected by this, and saying, in particular from Craig Foss, I want him to stand up and say that he is sorry for trying to blame the schools, because when the system first went live and all of those problems came up, Craig Foss came to this House and tried to blame the schools. He needs to stand up now, take a call in this debate and give them an unqualified, unreserved apology, because he was totally wrong. The responsibility for this fiasco rests with him.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr.